When they were found, these feral children had almost no experience of human loving care, language, or social behavior. These are 10 children who were raised by wild animals. Number 10. Indian Wolf Boy. Dani Sanichar was found in Sekandra, India, after spending 6 years in the wild, where he'd been living among wolves. He'd been cared for at the Sekandra orphanage and was described as mentally subnormal. The boy was 6 years of age when he was found by woodcutters in the jungles of Bulandshahr. They were amazed to see the child running on all fours and following a wolf into its den. After they smoked it out, the men shot the wolf and took Dani with them. At first, the boy exhibited a behavior typical of a wild animal, eating food off the ground and tearing his clothes off. He never learned to speak, but ultimately developed a taste for cooked meat instead of eating it raw. Number 9. Ugandan Monkey Boy. Born in the mid-1980s, John Sekandra ran away from home after witnessing his mother being murdered by his father. The boy was around 3 years old when he started living in the jungle, where he was mainly cared for by African monkeys. In 1991, a woman named Millie found John hiding in a tree. She came back with men from the village to try and capture the boy. John resisted, and the monkeys he'd been living with tried to defend him by throwing sticks and rocks at the villagers. The villagers noticed that his entire body was covered with hair due to a process called hypertrichosis and wounds and scars, presumably because he crawled to get around. The child was identified as John Sekandra and taken in by a charitable organization for orphans. His story ultimately became a fortunate one. He learned to speak and even sing, touring with the Pearl of Africa Children's Choir. He also became the subject of a 1999 BBC film called Living Proof. Number 8. Andes Goat Boy. Found in 1990 in the Andes, Peru, initially referred to as the Andes Goat Boy and believed to have been raised by goats for 8 years. He survived by eating berries and roots and drinking goat milk. He was 12 years old when he was found by hitchhikers in 1990. He'd been living with a goat herd in the mountains and had allegedly developed a feral behavior that included walking on 4 limbs and an ability to communicate with goats. Scar formation on his hands and feet had hardened to the point where they acted like hooves. After he was found, the Andes Goat Boy was investigated by a team from the University of Kansas who named him Daniel. Their progress was slow as Daniel couldn't learn human language and displayed a very restricted range of emotions. Number 7. Syrian Gazelle Boy. In the 1940s, a feral boy was found in the Syrian desert, living with a herd of gazelles. He was captured with the help of an Iraqi army jeep as he could run at incredible speeds of up to 35 miles per hour. Although very thin, he was described as extremely strong and fit. He was bound and placed in a state institution. His story was included in a Life magazine issue from September 1946, which reported the month before a group of hunters from the Syrian steppes had found a wild boy running with a herd of gazelles. At the time of his discovery, the boy was said to have been between 10 and 14 years old, and it was suspected that he'd been abandoned as an infant. He was placed in an insane asylum. In 1955, it was reported that he'd attempted to escape from the facility where he was being held. Number 6. Nigerian Chimp Boy. In 1996, when he was only 2 years old, Bello, also known as the Nigerian Chimp Boy, was discovered living with a chimpanzee family in northern Nigeria, about 90 miles south of Kano. Bello was physically and mentally disabled. The Fulani, a nomadic people that travel the West African Sahel, had a common practice of abandoning disabled children. It was assumed that Bello had been abandoned by his parents when he was 6 months old. It's believed that the chimpanzees adopted him as their own. He was taken to the Tudun Maleki home in Kano. When he was first brought to the orphanage, he acted in a way typical of a chimpanzee. He walked on his legs but dragged his arms on the ground. He would smash and throw things and had trouble communicating with other children. Even though Bello was calmer after 6 years spent around humans, he would still leap around like a chimp and make chimp-like noises. Number 5. Ukrainian Dog Girl. Oksana Malaya was not considered to be a feral child as much as one neglected by her alcoholic parents for most of her childhood. Between the ages of 3 and 8, she spent most of her time in the kennel in the back garden of her family's home in Ukraine. Oksana was cared for by the wild dogs roaming the streets where she lived, and she adopted their mannerisms and behaviors. When the authorities first came to rescue her, they were driven away by the dogs and Oksana, who behaved like them, growling, barking, and walking on all fours. She developed acute senses of smell, sight, and hearing. In 1991, when found, she could only say yes or no. The dogs had been the only emotional support that she'd known, and she'd been deprived of social and intellectual stimulation. Oksana was taken to a home for the mentally disabled. The facility also had a farm where she would help looking after the cows. Number 4. Russian Bird Boy. A 7-year-old boy was rescued by Russian care workers in 2008 from a small 2-room apartment that was full of cages with dozens of birds and covered in droppings and bird feed. Nicknamed the Bird Boy, he couldn't speak human language and communicated by flapping his arms and chirping. According to Galina Volskaya, a social worker that assisted in his rescue, he wasn't harmed by his mother or left without food. Instead, he suffered from the Mowgli syndrome, named after the character raised by animals from the Jungle Book, and couldn't participate in normal human communication. His mother treated him like another pet and never spoke to him, which is why he learned the language of the birds. The boy's mother signed a form releasing him into care, and he was initially transferred to an asylum and later to a psychological care center. Number 3. Romanian Dog Boy. Traian Caldera was just a small child when he ran away from home. His mother had a violent partner who beat her constantly, and this drove Traian away. He was found by shepherd Ion Manolescu in the Transylvanian countryside after his car broke down. Traian was 7 but only the size of an infant and was believed to have lived with stray dogs for over 3 years. He suffered from infected injuries, severe rickets, and poor circulation, possibly due to frostbite. He was naked, living in a cardboard box next to the body of a dog he'd apparently been eating. Traian couldn't speak, and his movements and behavior were animalistic. Number 2. Cambodian Jungle Girl. Rochom Penggien emerged from the Cambodian jungle naked, filthy, and afraid on January 13, 2007. She was caught by villagers in the Ratanakiri province after one of them noticed food missing from a lunchbox. Rochom was identified by her father based on the large scar she had on her back. Rochom was lost in the jungle when she was 8 while herding buffalo with her younger sister, who also disappeared. The astonishing fact is that Rochom had survived in the jungle for over 18 years. It's believed that she'd been raised by animals, which explained her preference to crawl instead of walking. She only knew 3 words: mother, father, and stomachache. After spending most of her life in the wild, she had trouble adjusting to the civilized world and attempted to run back into the jungle several times, even though her family watched her around the clock. Rochom eventually fled back to the jungle in May 2010. Despite extensive search efforts, she was never found again. Number 1. Wolf Girls of Midnapore. One of the most well-known and controversial stories regarding feral children is that of Amala and Kamala. One of the girls was 8 years old and the other was 18 months old when they were found together in a wolf's den. It was suspected that the girls weren't sisters, but instead had been taken or abandoned by wolves several years apart. Reverend Joseph Singh, a missionary in charge of a North Indian orphanage, had heard legends of 2 ghost-like apparitions spotted accompanying a pack of wolves in the Bengal jungle in the Midnapore area. Based on the stories told by the locals, Singh found the entrance to the wolf lair in 1920. At night, when the moon rose, the wolves started coming out one by one. Then 2 frightening, hunched creatures slowly creeped out of the lair. The manner the girls thought or acted showed almost no trace of humanity. They only ate raw meat and ripped off any clothes put on them. They curled up in a tight ball when they slept and twitched and growled in their sleep. Amala and Kamala would only wake up when the moon rose and began to howl to be let free. Because they'd spent so much time on all fours, their joints and tendons had shortened drastically, making it impossible for them to stand upright. According to Singh, the girls even had wolf-like senses. Their eyes were incredibly sharp in the dark, and they could smell a piece of meat across the 3-acre yard of the orphanage. The girls never smiled, and the only human emotion or expression they showed was fear. A religious and well-educated man, Singh tried his best to help them find the human characteristics he felt were blocked out by their lupine ways. Unfortunately, Amala, the younger girl, became sick and died. This hindered his progress with Kamala, who had just begun to stop fear in humans, but after a long period of mourning, Kamala eventually recovered and the rehabilitation program continued.
Hey guys, it's Angelo, producer of this channel. I wanted to let you all know I've set up a Patreon account where I'll be offering very exciting and very exclusive bonus footage available only to people on Patreon. There, your voice will be heard regarding things you want to see and which direction I take my channel. Click on the end screen here to find out more, or on the link in the description below. Thanks guys, and I hope to see you on Patreon soon.